So when I'm starting a new design, I like to just sort of sketch things out. This is all done in Procreate. I normally just use the pencil sketch brush and kind of block out some initial ideas. I'm not too worried about how accurate everything is or like how close it is to the proper proportions and anatomy. I just kind of want to get the basic idea. For this specific drawing, I wanted to do a zombie sci-fi elephant thing. So the idea is there's this gladiator ring in the future, and they kind of have these like robotics that control the bodies of animals and humans instead of a virus or something taking over them. So I want the robotics to kind of feel like they're controlling the bodies. They're a bit like invasive, but sort of like an exoskeleton kind of thing. So I sketched out just like the side profile shot of an elephant body and then tried as many variations as I could for the robotics design. And at this stage, I'm really just focused on the silhouettes, like how it looks on that initial read, and I don't care too much about all the finer details and everything. So then I'm just kind of sketching out how the face might look once I found an idea that I kind of liked a little bit more. And I wanted to see like how the tusks and the robotics along the trunk would kind of work together and look. Okay, so now that I kind of have an idea of what I want everything to look like, I want to start thinking about what my final image is going to be. So I start sketching things out in Photoshop. Now I'm being a bit more accurate in elephant anatomy and everything. And yeah, I want to kind of get an idea for what I want the lighting to look like, what I want the elephant's pose to be. So yeah, I just do some quick sketching in Photoshop. I'm only spending an hour or so on this as well. But it's just to kind of act as a guideline for what my modeling process is and everything. Like I just refer back to this, and eventually once I get into posing, I'm looking at this image. So it's important then to know what your final dimensions of the image will be so that you know what angle you need to be viewing the model from, and get an idea for what sort of focal length you want. So the focal length would be, there's like 50 millimeters, which is kind of just like the standard baseline, which is what the eye sees. But in this case, I want it to be a bit exaggerated and kind of warped, almost like fisheye lens. So you're going to go lower focal length. So, yeah. I'm also thinking about the lighting and the sort of mood I want to create. So I know that it's going to be top-down lighting, and I want it to create some dramatic shadows on the elephant's body so that the elephant feels as big and intimidating as possible. That way, it's also going to be casting a deep, dark shadow on the ground plane. Yeah, the idea for the gladiator ring is that it's kind of like within this cave-like environment. So it's going to be a very like misty and foggy atmosphere. Some like rocks on the side with some plants growing, and then the ground will be just this like sandy, kind of gravelly platform, but like a bright color just to have that sort of contrast between the walls and the ground. And then that also allows you to get that, yeah, the contrast and that dark shadow from the elephant on the ground. So now we're bringing things into ZBrush. I always start with just like the basic sphere, and there's no subdivisions or anything on it. I'm just going to be working in Dynamesh at this point because you're going to be doing a lot of pulling and extruding of parts, and you want to be able to just hit Dynamesh to remesh the entire thing, just so that you can continue to model and you're not losing any detail or stretching any polygons or anything. I also, in this stage, will be referring a lot to anatomy textbooks. A really good one that I like to use is by Elliot Goldfinger, and he has human anatomy for artists, and there's a good one when you're doing animals. It's just animal anatomy for artists, and there's like, it'll break down all the muscle groups and everything. You don't need to get that technical with this thing because we're not really modeling it from the skeleton up, but you still want to be paying attention to those landmarks, like where all the joints are and the major muscle groups and that sort of thing, and how the muscles are flowing and connecting together. So when you go to the top of the ZBrush window, the top right, there's like an opacity slider that you can lower the opacity, and I like to have an image underneath of just like the profile and maybe the front view so that you can keep all your proportions accurate to how it would be in real life. And yeah, it just sort of helps as keep you as a guide so that you're not getting carried away and maybe making the neck too long or head too big or whatever. Yeah, so then I'm really just sort of using the move and scale brush to kind of warp the sphere in the way I want it to, and then masking certain parts out so that I can pull other parts, and then that allows me to get the legs and the trunk and head and everything, always working in symmetry at this point, and then yeah, just sort of refining it using the clay build-up brush and the move tool to just sort of, start to sculpt everything. But again, just working very general and not worrying about any details just yet. I just want to get everything in place and make sure it's looking correct. looking at things from all kinds of angles and just making sure it's working from the back and beneath and everything, and then every now and then turning off your perspective view and lowering the opacity again just to double check against those anatomy images to make sure that everything's still in the right place and that, you know, everything's the right width and length and that kind of thing. When I want to do any wrinkles or details like around the mouth, I'm using the damn standard brush, and that just allows you to carve some nice lines into the model, but still for the most part just clay buildup brush and move tool, and then you can use the clay buildup to build up areas and carve away, and then every now and then just hitting Dynamesh just to retopologize it, or not retopologize, but just like set everything back so that this is your new base mesh, and you can keep sculpting on top of that and not worry about losing anything. And in this model, I'm gonna do the ears as a separate subtool because I don't want it. Sometimes it can be a little difficult to get the area behind the ears and everything. So just because the elephant's ears are kind of big and I'm not sure yet how much I want them flared out or back against the body, I'm just going to keep them separate so that I can modify them a little bit easier. So the reference images that I'm using for this, I was able to find some pretty disturbing photos of emaciated elephants online. I hope those elephants are doing okay now, but it helped me a lot for this image when I'm looking for kind of a sickly zombie-looking elephant. So I'm really looking at how the skin is kind of drooping over the hip bones and the shoulder blades and everything, or even just like on the forehead. So it really pronouncing that the cheekbone kind of area, and then I'm looking to see where the muscles are kind of showing through the skin as well, and then referencing back to my anatomy textbook and just kind of trying to get the flow of the muscles correct on like the forearm or like that lower leg there. And yeah, just continuing to refine the shapes. And this is kind of a long process, and sometimes it helps to sort of step away and come back so you get fresh eyes on it and can kind of see where things are incorrect, or if the weight's off, you want to make it feel like it's balanced. Working on these models, I like to think ahead and be like, in the future, I might want to use an elephant model again. And when I do that, I won't have to start from scratch if I do a decent job with this. So, yeah, I want to keep it in this standing pose, but then work it to a fairly detailed level, not go too crazy. Like I don't want to. I want to be able to reuse the things that I'm working on, and eventually I'll have like a whole Noah's Ark of animal models that I can just sort of use and modify for whatever projects I'm working on. Yeah, so this guy, I guess technically, if you were just going to only do this one image of an elephant, then maybe you could even start with him in that pose. But I don't know, for me, just to make sure the proportions are correct and everything, I like to have him just standing still so that I can make sure all the muscle groups are the right size, flowing in the right direction. When things are posed, it can get a bit more confusing, so I just like to keep it simple like this at first and then do all the posing later. Okay, so eventually you get to the point where the elephant body's done, and then I could save this as its own version and then be like, all right, here's your baseline elephant. And then I want to add the robotics in, but I'm going to keep the robotics all as separate subtools just so that I can change them as I go and they're easier to modify without affecting the rest of the model. And yeah, like you can move them into place and scale them however you want. The more you refine things, the more you're going to see problems with stuff, so it's good to just have it as a separate subtool for now. And yeah, again, just using the scale and masking tools to kind of warp things into place. The the hard surface modeling is a little bit different than when you're just sculpting more organic forms, because you want to have those hard edges or a smooth surface kind of thing. So, and eventually, if you're extruding a cube, then the polygons will start to stretch and it starts to get a little, the forms get a little weird. So you want to Dynamesh those as well. But when I'm hitting Dynamesh, I also make sure that I have the polish box checked, and that just kind of keeps the forms a bit more rigid, and it allows you to keep modifying them. And I'm also using I think it's the H polish brush or something like that, which will flatten edges and then also give you a nice kind of sharp edge, and that's a good tool to use for hard surface modeling. And also, if you're using the clay buildup brush, sometimes it helps to have the alpha turned on, which is just like the square block, and that just like builds forms up, but in that consistent square. And yeah, sometimes that can be useful with hard surface modeling. So still with the hard surface modeling, very similar to the sculpting of the actual elephant body. Like, I'm just looking at the overall shape of it and not worried about any details just yet. But when I get to the detail part, I like to use a layer so that I can kind of sculpt in the shapes that I want and add those extra details and the lines and everything in the robotics as if they were like put together with plates and that sort of thing. So layers are helpful because it doesn't commit you to anything that you sculpt on that more general shape, and then eventually if you're happy with it, then you can just bake all, and that will make the layers a part of that actual subtool. So yeah, with this I'm just using the Dam Standard brush, or Damien Standard, but short form like Dam Standard. And yeah, I'm just carving in some lines. I'm not too worried about how crisp or fancy the hard surface modeling is, because I'm going to be doing some painting over later in Photoshop. I'm just kind of trying to get a basic idea so that we can render out some lights, and then it'll show you kind of how the light will cast on everything. But again, you're going to be painting over it, so I don't like to spend too much time on the hard surface stuff and making it look super fancy. Yeah, I think the most important thing for me, at least, is the animal anatomy, because that's just like, yeah, the main focus of the piece. Eventually, once you're working through everything, you get yourself to the point that you're ready to start posing. It doesn't make sense to keep modeling and going further because, again, you're drawing on top of this afterwards. You just want to have like a good foundation or base model that you can paint over top of. So once you're ready to start posing, you go to Z plugin, and then there's the transpose tool, and you T-pose your mesh, and that will take all your subtools and kind of put them together as one object that you can mask and move things all together, and you don't have to worry about moving everything individually. And then when you're done, you just hit T-pose sub-T, and then that'll put everything into place, but then you'll have your separate subtools again. So yeah, then I'm in this stage, I'm looking back to that sketch that I did in Photoshop, and I'm trying to place the limbs in the stance that I had envisioned for the elephant kind of charging at the camera. And it's unless, like, it depends on the pose, but normally you don't want to have things on symmetry at this stage because you're going to be moving limbs individually and everything. So it's important to mask things very carefully and always double check to make sure that you haven't selected parts in the back of the body or on the side that you weren't really looking, because then you can start to move things and then that'll pull stuff on the other end and it just becomes a whole mess. So always just double check that your selection is exactly what you want to be moving, and then you can click on the edge of the mask and that'll soften or sharpen the edge of the selected mask area depending on how you want to move it. Normally, if I'm moving limbs on the elephant's body, I want that edge nice and soft so that you have like a smooth transition and you're not getting any sharp lines. But depending on how you're moving things and how far you're bending the joints and everything, you're eventually going to get some hard lines in the actual model, but it's not that big of a deal. You can always smooth that out later. And that's why I like to keep things in Dynamesh so that you can, revise those shapes and resculpt the muscles a bit so that the anatomy is correct and you're not worried about all the polygons. If you had subdivided at this point, it's just, it makes things a bit more messy. So I like to just keep things in Dynamesh all the time until I'm texturing. Another really important thing when it comes to posing is you want to make sure that you're only moving the body parts on places where there would be a joint or the skeleton is able to actually bend there. You don't want to be bending in the middle of the forearm or something. If you want to keep it accurate, you're looking at the skeleton and being like, okay, here's my elbow joint, here's my wrist joint, and so you select and then rotate things along that point. And then same with the robotics. You want to kind of look at where all the pieces are fitting together and select along those edges and not bend in the middle of them. You kind of want to keep things as like, this is how it would function in the real world. So don't bend at weird points, basically. decided that I wanted to add some holes into the ear on one of the ears of this elephant. So sometimes if you're still in Dynamesh, you can just mask out that area and then go to visibility and then hide points, and then you can go to modify topology and then delete hidden. And then once you take the mask off, you can Dynamesh. Sometimes that will keep the hole there, and it'll create a nice hole for you in the mesh. So in this case, it wasn't really working out properly, so all I did was I duplicated the ear, and then again, like, masked out the area, hid the points, deleted the hidden points, and then in the duplicated ear, I just had the inverse hidden and deleted, so that I have like the two pieces that I want, and then I just merged them together and Dynameshed it, and that created the holes that I wanted. It's just kind of like two different ways to get to the same point. But again, the beauty of working in Dynamesh is you can just keep modifying the crap out of your model, and it doesn't matter, because it can always just like become one solid mesh again. Okay, so once I have the elephant posed in the way I want it to, this is where I do my subdividing, because I just want to add a bit more texturing to the skin of the elephant with alphas. It's not necessarily like how you would do things if you were going to be working on a model for a game or film or whatever, but since this is just for the one illustration, this is kind of the easiest way that I find. So yeah, you duplicate the Dynamesh model subtool that you have of the elephant body, and then for the duplicated subtool, you're going to go to Z-remesher and Z-remesh the body. Doesn't necessarily matter too much like how the topology looks. If you're not using this or rigging it, it's just kind of like, this is just sort of simplifying the topology that you have. And then you're going to subdivide that remeshed model once, and then make sure that the Dynamesh elephant body is visible underneath it, and then you're going to go to project and project all, so that you're projecting that subdivided elephant onto the Dynamesh elephant. And then that'll kind of make the make the model look a little closer to everything that you sculpted beforehand, just on a simpler topology level. And then you're going to divide that again, and then project all again, and that'll kind of refine forms even more. And then do that a couple more times. So subdivide, and then project all, and then subdivide and project all. And normally I want to get the subdivision subtool to about 4 or 5 subdivisions, because that'll give you a nice sort of base that you can pull some alphas onto, and you'll get all the detail that you want and everything. So yeah, eventually you have that subdivided tool, and then you're going to go to the standard brush, and then you want to use it on the drag rectangle stroke, and then find an alpha. You can either use one of the standard ones there, or you can find some online and then just import those, and then yeah, drag them onto the body. And yeah, when you're doing this, you kind of want to pay attention to the reference images that you have. So looking at an elephant's body, in this particular case, this is an Indian elephant. So the wrinkles and, I don't know, like the depth and the actual cracks on the skin isn't as severe as it would be on an African elephant. So I'm just sort of thinking about that. And also, when you're looking at the body, most of the wrinkles are around like the hind legs and the lower parts of the body, whereas like the top of the head and along the spine, the skin's generally a bit smoother. And then there's more wrinkles and cracks and everything down by the feet and wrist joints and knees and elbows and those kinds of things. So I'm just kind of adding most of my detail and texturing in there, and then not worrying too much about how accurate it is or covering every inch of the body, but it kind of gives you that added level of realism and extra things for the light to cast on and for you to paint over in Photoshop. And then you're going to you can start poly painting the model, and if you go to mRGB, you can fill the entire object, or if you're just using RGB, then you can just paint directly on it. You just want to make sure that Z add and Z subtract are turned off and you're using the standard brush. And you can also use different brush strokes to get different effects, like for the front of the face, like on the trunk and on the bottom of the ears. The Indian elephants have this kind of cool speckly freckle dot kind of thing going on, so I was using the different strokes for that. And yeah, you're just sort of referencing the colors that you have in your reference images, and yeah, just have fun painting, but you don't have to go too crazy with it. I don't spend too much time in this stage, but it'll give you a nice base to paint over. Eventually, you're going to have everything painted and textured in the way you want it to. So I just want to double check that this pose works for the focal length of like the camera lens that I want in the image. So if you go to draw, there's a little camera icon, and then below that it has the different focal lengths, and I kind of play around with them, but for me this one works well at like 28 millimeters. So I move the thing around and try to see, like, okay, I don't want the legs overlapping too much, like I want it to have a strong silhouette, and then I'm trying to make sure that the spikes of the trunk aren't layered behind the tusks or anything. I don't want to lose any of that information, so then I'm just T-posing the model again just to modify things slightly. And then once I kind of have it in the right place, then I go into movie, and there's the timeline, and then you can show that timeline and then once you have the mesh or like the whole model posed the way you want it, and from the camera view that you want, you can just click on that timeline and it'll lock that view, and then you can use the tab keys to move in between however many views you want to lock in place. And then if you move away from that view, if you by accident touch the screen or whatever, you can always just press the tab key and that'll get you back to that view. And then I want to start setting up the lights in the way that I sketched out before. So the thing with the materials is that certain materials will have baked in lighting. Like all the matte cap materials have the lighting already baked into them. So you can kind of change the direction that the light is casting on them, but if you wanted to have like a certain color fill light or really change the direction, have a rim light on it, you're gonna want to use the standard materials. And yeah, I like to set the model to a bunch of different materials and render those out just so that you have a bit of variety in how the light is casting on it and like the different detailing that you're getting with the different material effects. So I start with just like a basic material, or yeah, the basic material, and then I set up the lights to how I want them. So with these, I wanted that really dramatic top light, but then I still want to be able to see the details in the elephant's body, so I set up a fill light underneath it and maybe one more light just to kind of fill things out a bit better. And then I hit BPR and just sort of double check that that's working. And there's ways of adjusting the shadows as well. If you go into render and the BPR shadow, you can adjust the amount of rays and the G strength and blur and resolution and all that kind of stuff. Play around with those and see, and eventually you'll get kind of the effect that you're going for. But once again, you're painting over top of it, so you just kind of want this as like a solid base to paint over. It doesn't need to be perfect, or sometimes you get some weird things going on with the shadows that might work or might be like how this model actually would look under that lighting, but you can always adjust it to make your image look a little bit better. If you don't want so much light on the back leg, for instance, you can always just paint that out. But if it looks really nice on the face and everything, then just leave it, don't worry about it. And then yeah, just play around with the materials and find ones that you like. Like I try to get one that's a bit more reflective, or like I play around with the metals for the robotics, and then like tried out the jelly bean. Normally these are for like a specular pass, so you just want to turn everything to the color black, and you're not using like the poly paint colors. This way, when you get into Photoshop, you can just set these render passes as an adjustment layer over top of your main render, and then that'll add some extra little highlights and specular detail to your model. You just kind of composite them all together once you get to that stage. So for now, just play around with some materials, BPR, save out those renders as PSDs, and then eventually we're going to bring everything into Photoshop. So then you open up your Photoshop and then you bring everything together and yeah, import all those render passes, and then you open up your main render with the poly paint color and everything on it, and then you go to the other ones, select all, and paste them on top. It's good to start off with the flat color, and that way you can select the skin and then just sort of create a group that's masked just for the skin, so that any adjustment layer you bring in there, you can play around with it and get some nice sweaty or whatever skin looking effects. And then you have a folder that's masked out just so that it's isolating the robotics, and then you can play around with adjustment layers until you get like a nice shiny robotic. I like to use the color dodge or linear dodge normally works to get a nice like shiny effect, and then other render passes work better on multiply, but there's no exact way to do it. But yeah, just play around with it and see what kind of cool effects you can get until it looks about ready for you to start painting over. One of the most important things to do before you start your final painting is just take that composited render of your elephants, which is just like all of your render layers together, and open up a new document that's set to the size of your final image. Yeah, so bring that in, and then you're just doing like a really rough paint over to kind of get an idea of where you're headed with things. And yeah, it's just like a super helpful guideline so that you can refer back to it and you're not getting too crazy when you're working on your final and just messing around. It's just like you only want to spend a couple minutes on this, maybe like 30 minutes tops, but it will help you out so much in the long run. Like as I was doing this, I realized that it looks like the elephant's kind of just standing still and lifting a leg and swinging his trunk, but I wanted it to feel more like he was charging, so I decided that I would angle that back leg inwards so that he was kind of leaning to one side as if he was just like running into the camera kind of thing, and then putting more force and momentum into that swing. And yeah, again, it's not necessary to do this step, but I would say definitely do it because it'll help you out so much when you go into your final painting. And then I have that open in a window right beside my final painting, especially at the beginning stages, just for when I'm setting things up and adjusting the colors and everything to how I kind of want the final to look. It's not like you're using this as like, this is exactly how things are going to look. It's just to sort of like give you a guideline of where things are going, but feel free to adjust things and adjust the color of things in your final painting so that it looks as beautiful as it can look. It might feel a little redundant at first to be starting all over again, but I promise you it's worth it. Just trust me. on the final painting, I'm even selecting parts of the model and warping them, which sounds crazy, I know, but technically the anatomy wouldn't be perfect, but it's okay because you're just trying to make this final image look as beautiful as possible, and all that modeling and stuff was worth it and makes this look 10 times more realistic than if you were to just illustrate it yourself, in my opinion. So like I was warping that front foot so that it looked like it was angled a bit more and a bit more exaggerated and coming at the camera. And then I angled that back leg back, and then now I'm just sort of adding some highlights to the top of the tusks because I thought the highlight on them wasn't bright enough and I want them to stand out a bit more and kind of be really defined. So I'm just adding a bright white highlight to the top of those and to the top of the robotics on the eyes as well. The whole time I'm working on this, I have my reference images opened up, and then I'm looking at the freckles and the patterning and wrinkles on an elephant. So to paint in the freckles, that's all just different coloring on the elephant's skin, but the shadows being cast on it would be the same as the shadows cast on like the actual form of the elephant's face. So it's helpful to just paint those differences in color as an overlay layer so that you're still getting the effect on the value of the color and not exactly like changing those values or whatever. So so those freckles get that same bright highlight, and then the dark shadow as it moves around the edge of the elephant's face and around the trunk and everything. And the same goes for the wrinkles. I'm just painting those as on a multiply layer so that you're still sort of getting the shape and the form, but then you're adding that extra like darkness to it. You can also use lighten and darken layers as well. I think I was using lighten on the patterning on the ears. That just works to brighten colors that are dark, kind of thing. The whole time that I'm painting, I'm zooming in, zooming out, and flipping the canvas just to make sure that everything's working and try to like freshen my eyes and not get too used to one view of it. I just want to make sure that it works from all angles and sides. And then I'm also checking the gray values to make sure that all the actual like values of the colors are correct. I go into view and then proof setup and hit custom, and then in the devices to simulate I go into that drop down window and then click dot gain 20%. So that way when I'm working in RGB, once you hit Control Y, you'll get the absolute gray value of the image, and that just takes out all the color information and you get a good look at what those values actually are. And that's just a good thing to double check, just to make sure that you're not painting anything too dark or too bright. So I'm just painting in some rock type details in the background. It's all going to be blurred and fairly out of focus just through all the mist and everything, so I'm not spending too much time on this, but I'm just looking at some kind of like waterfalls and the wet rocks underneath that just to kind of get an idea for reference. And then I'm using some smoke brushes that I have to paint over some mist and smoke. And then some of these I'm setting on overlay or soft light, and then putting a mask over top of it just to kind of define those shapes a bit better and make it look a little bit prettier. And then, yeah, painting in the sand and dust and all the little mist particles and everything. And it's pretty meticulous, and you might be able to find some PNGs or something that would get you all these dot effects a little bit easier, but I just like to kind of paint that stuff in myself. And yeah, just keep working it, and always checking your values, and eventually you'll get it to the point that you want it to be. what I like to do is I take the entire image that I just painted, and I duplicate it and I flatten that image, just so that I'm not flattening the actual file I worked on, just in case. And then I bring that flattened image back into the file, and then I blur that at 1%. And then I do some custom lens corrections and skew either the magenta fringe or the blue fringe or whatever looks kind of cool. And this kind of just blurs everything a bit and gives you a nice photographic look. And then I make a new layer, fill it with 50% gray, and then add noise to that, and then set that as an overlay, and then lower that to around like 10 to 20%. You just kind of want to feel it. You don't need to like see it, but that just kind of adds some noise and just messes things up a bit, gives it more of a photographic look. The whole purpose of all those finishing touches is just to kind of hide any evidence that this was a painting or a 3D model. You don't want to be able to see all those brush strokes and everything. I kind of just like to blend everything together a bit nicer, a bit more seamlessly. So that's why I kind of blur things or add the noise, so that it doesn't look like this is just a painting over top of a 3D model. And yeah, it just makes it look like one solid, cohesive image. And that's about it. So thanks so much, guys. Hopefully you made it through that 2.5 hours and I didn't bore you to death. I hope this was interesting and educational. And if there's anything that you see that I'm doing and you're like, dude, there's a way easier way of doing that, feel free to comment or reach out to me. I would really appreciate that. But this is just the way that works for me and that I found. Yeah, so have fun. Thank you.